We've been very excited to have John here. I've learned, and you may have learned, John has an extensive resume. He's just had a new book out. So it was published in September. That's Of Earth, New and Selected Poems, which presents poems from his two previous collections, Common Ground and All Things Touched by Wind, and a generous selection of newer work. His poems have appeared widely in anthologies, and a commissioned poem, which is untitled, appears as a 270-foot frieze in the interior of the Fern Ridge Library at Veneta. In Veneta. John and his wife, Marilyn, live in the foothills west of Eugene, near Veneta. He's a former Wallace Stegner Fellow in Poetry at Stanford University. He was poetry editor of Wilderness Magazine from 1988 until the magazine ceased in 1911. In 1998, he compiled... 2011? See, now I've told John, this audience, everybody's really listening closely. And so they're paying attention. Yes, that is 2011. In 1998, he compiled a collection of verse first published in Wilderness that remains in print today. Common Ground, his first collection of poems, was an Oregon Book Award finalist in 1989. His most recent book of prose, The Far Corner, Northwestern Views on Land, Life, and Literature, was published in April 2009 and won the 2011 Oregon Book Award in Creative Nonfiction from Literary Arts. His other books of prose include The Trail Home, Rogue River Journal, Looking After, A Son's Memoir, and Winter Creek, One Writer's Natural History. He's a 3-time winner of the Oregon Book Award for Literary Nonfiction. He's also received a Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award and a fellowship for the National Endowment from the Arts. He's chair of PEN Northwest, a regional branch of the writers' organization PEN American Center. John was born in South Carolina, raised in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and has lived in the West since 1966. As I said, he and his wife Marilyn, plus 2 dogs, 2 cats, a dog, and usually a pack rat, he says, live in the Coast Ranges west of Eugene. So for more information about John, you can see his extensive bio on the city's website, or also John's website, which you can check on the invitation. So it's a great pleasure. We've been looking forward to this. Would you join me in welcoming our poet tonight, John Daniel? John Daniel.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Oh, excuse me. See, everybody's really paying attention.
Except for you, apparently.
So, would you everybody silence their telephonic devices, studios?
When I'm teaching college classes, my policy is to confiscate any phone that rings during classes. I wouldn't attempt that here. Well, first of all, thank all of you very much for turning out. It's lovely to look on this lovely packed house. I want to thank the library, the friends of the library, the city of Milwaukie, and everyone, all the individuals associated with making this reading series work, as it clearly does. But particularly I want to thank Tom Hogan. I knew I was in good hands from our earliest email correspondence. He saw to every least detail of the arrangements. And it's just both a pleasure and an honor to be part of what so many of you have already made a cultural literary institution of the greater Portland metro area. This, by the way, is the first public reading from my new book of anywhere. This book appears 18 years since publication of the second of my two previous collections. I got a little busy writing prose, which seemed to absorb, the poetic impulses I had, or maybe just drown them in a sea of expository and narrative sentences, paragraphs, sections, chapters. But I did keep writing them slowly. Once in a while I would turn to the little stacks of drafts. I keep every draft. And see what I could do to bring one or more of them along toward wholeness. So the book contains about half the poems from the two earlier collections each. Both are now out of print. And a third section of 24 newer poems. I came west in 1966 to pursue what turned out to be a brief student career at Reed College. I didn't know much. To my benefit, I knew I didn't know much. But I did know I'd come to a wonderful corner of the USA. As Tom mentioned, I grew up mainly in the greater burbs and the city itself of Washington, D.C. I never saw much of the interior Northwest, though, until 1973, when, years after dropping out of Reed, I fetched up in Klamath Falls for a railroad job and immediately felt robbed. This wasn't Oregon. This was Nevada North. Won't stay here long, I said to myself. I stayed 10 years. What had first seemed bleakness to my eastern eyes of the semi-arid terrain there turned to beauty before my eyes. And it was in that landscape that I became a poet and a writer. And it was in that landscape where I met Pauline Peterson. We were both then wannabe poets, wannabe writers, involved in small writers group of others like us. And Pauline at the time was an English teacher at Mazama High School in Klamath Falls. So we go way back, and it's great to see her and her husband Ken here tonight. So I wrote this first poem I'm going to read about myself, I suppose, and addressed to any Easterner drawn to come west. It was the first poem in Common Ground. It's the first poem in this new book. One place to begin. You need a reason, any reason. Skiing, a job in movies, the Golden Gate Bridge. Take your reason and drive west, past the Rockies. When you're bored with bare hills, dry flats, and distance, stop anywhere. Forget where you thought you were going. Rattle through the beer cans in the ditch. If there's a fence, try your luck. They don't stop cows. Follow the first hawk you see. And when the sagebrush trips you, take a good look before you get up. The desert gets by without government. Crush juniper berries, breathe the smell, smear your face. When you wonder why you're here, yell as loud as you can and don't look behind. Walk, your feet are learning. Admit you're afraid of the dark. Soak the warmth from scab rock, cheek to lichen. The wind isn't talking to you. Listen anyway. Let the cries of coyotes light a fire in your heart. Remember the terrible song of stars. You knew it once, before you were born. Tell a story about why the sun comes back. Sit still until the itches give up. Lizards ignore you. A mule deer holds you in her eyes. Explain yourself over and over. Forget it all when a scrub jay shrieks. Imagine sun, sky, and wind the same over your scattered white bones. You're close now. Wander up a dusty ravine until your nose smells something different Climb to the green grass, the stand of aspens. Squirm your toes in black mud with the tracks of hooves and paws. Drink. The face that rises to meet you has been waiting for you to come home. Garrison Keillor read that poem on Writer's Almanac, but I didn't get a chance to hear it. I'm sure he did a great job. Sometimes all you have to do to find a poem is to look outside the window, especially if it's a window you spend a lot of time looking through because it's where your writing table is, and you're spending so much time not writing, which is so much the process of writing. This little poem is titled The Elm in November. The slow labor of summer is finished, the yellow weight delivered to ground. Twigs jittering, buoyant with wind, the elm comes round once more to the grace of emptiness. It enters the cold unburdened, its life withdrawn inside, the solitude of its dark limbs. Exact pattern against gray sky, the spare shape of enough. If you've lived in rural areas, or maybe even if you haven't, and if you drive much, you probably at least had close call with a deer. Marilyn and I have each totaled a vehicle on a deer, or in her case, in avoiding a deer. In my case, killing it pretty good, because it was actually on I-5 in Northern California near Wairika, and I was going 65 on the freeway. Couldn't swerve, and probably shouldn't have. You can't write a poem about a dead or dying deer on a road without thinking of William Stafford's poem. And I reference it very briefly in an epigraph. The epigraph is, "My only swerving W.S." This was actually about the first deer I hit in Northern California way back in the early 70s. The deer I hit on I-5 died instantly. This one, unfortunately, did not. A crossing. Blinded in light, the deer stopped. My fender crumpled, hurled her down the bank. I found her thrashing, her broken legs trying to run. Pleading, hating her ruined life, I grabbed a rock and hammered her head again and again, and stood breathing hard in the silence of stars and pines, smeared rock a perfect fit in my fingers. Again my headlights tunneled the dark. I gripped the wheel, one of the strangers who kill at any crossing, without the stomach to pay dead life the respect of an honest hunger. I wrote this poem after hearing, well, as the title will tell you, the title is After Hearing from a Friend. Since you called, I've been walking the wet grass listening to frogs, their steady chorus pulsing along, until a few at a time they hush, and the last frog chirps kind of silly for a while and quits. My loud footsteps, wind in the trees, stars scattered like farm lights, lonely on the prairie. Are you there? 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 And every damn bubble-throated frog in the meadow is chirping its heart out. Who knows why they sing, but tonight it feels like celebration. Tonight, I think the only reason they stop is for the pleasure of starting again. When I got my first job as a poet, teaching as a poet in the schools, as Carlos has done everywhere, and Paul Ann has done everywhere, and many, many, many poets have. The validation of that first job was pretty important to me. Hard work, kids will take everything you've got. Everything. In its way, it was as hard work as setting chokers for Weyerhaeuser. More enjoyable. One way I had of getting school kids to write was to read them coyote stories from Gerald Ramsey's wonderful collection, Coyote Was Going There. I would then ask them to write their own, and they came up with some wonderful, wonderful stories. Call them poems, call them prose, who cares? Eventually I decided that I too should do my own assignment, should at least try, and this next poem resulted. It's a different telling of the events that occur in Genesis 2, verses 19-20, where the beasts of the field and all the other creatures are summoned before Adam so that he can name them. It seems to me there must be other accounts of what went on that day. This is called Naming the New One. They came from mountains and plains to see the new one, the smooth skin, who stood on shaking hind legs and stared, his eye struck with light. He'll sleep cold, Bear grunted and walked away. Bigfoot was already gone, scared, and Hummingbird had things to do. As the others walked and crawled and flew by, the new one pointed and hurled a sound at each of them, louder and louder in his harsh joy. Those paws are no good, said Gopher. Call him Wildmouth, said Deer. Does he have ears? He'll learn a song, maybe, said Owl. Long after the new one stumbled away, they heard him crashing the brush, still trailing his strange calls. Doesn't see where he's going, Cougar said. Well, said Coyote, we'll always know when he's coming. Coyote acted brave, but he was nervous. Let's watch him for a while, he said. There's plenty of room. When he finds his place, then we'll name him. Still waiting, I reckon. The next poem, which is from my second collection, is titled Here, and it's H-E-R-E, Here. If you'll close your eyes and light the inner dark, you'll see a field, a grassy plain extending to a line of far blue hills. And as you walk, you'll feel the brushing softness of the grass, the coolness underfoot. You have no memory of where or why you started. You only know that the speck you've been approaching rises whole before you now, a solitary tree of long and curving limbs, its deep green leaves shimmering with the breeze that laves your face, and through the play of leaves you see the blue of sky, a few bright clouds, the range of distant hills. Improbable that a tree stands here, and you stand too, the steady ground beneath you, and all around the lively air. But unlikely as it is, this is exactly where you've arrived, the place you've never seen yet recognize, the rendezvous no one arranged. You can't stay long. You're traveling to the hills and won't return. So look carefully once more before you leave. Hills, field, the shimmering tree. How is it that you're here to stand and see? I forget its title, but Walt Whitman has a little poem in which he confesses that whatever he set out to do, the mere fact of awareness, he says that the mere fact consciousness, I think is his phrase, was so splendid, so rich, so impossible, yet utterly real, that he never really got any further than singing the praises of what came to him in consciousness. I do some of that. The hint of the mortality, the hint of mortality in that poem is a theme I've approached more directly in many poems. I've wrestled my entire life with the certain knowledge that I will die. Like William Saroyan, I know that everybody has to die, but I always assumed an exemption would occur in my case. It's all through my work, and it's as though I've turned mortality, the prospect of my own mortality, into some kind of engine driving my work in writing. This may be the only persona poem I've ever written. When you see the personal pronoun in my poems, it's pretty much me. But not in this case. I in this poem is not me. And for the reader, I've cued this by use of an epigraph. The poem is titled The Longing, and the epigraph is 2 lines from Emily Dickinson. Death is the supple suitor that wins at last. When he slipped on the mountain, I would have held him, but he chose the jolt of the rope. When the raft overturned in the canyon, he was confused. He went up instead of down to my arms. I wait to the right, he turns left. I am on time, he is early or late. I whisper when he lies awake at night. He turns on a light. He pretends he does not know me. I cannot forget his face. Every day he becomes more beautiful, and my longing becomes harder to bear. But I wait. I know him better than I know myself. I know him better than he knows himself. I watch him walk in circles, lift his feet in the same worn tracks. All the time he comes to me, like a moth in love with the moon. I watch him read books, scratch words on paper. He will understand nothing until he looks in my eyes. I watch him build his heap of things, find friends and lose them, couple and part. I am the one always beyond his reach. I was with him in the darkness of the womb. They took him out screaming. He promised to come back to me. When I step from behind that final tree, he will throw down everything, even his name. And before we lie down together, he will hold out the handful of blood that remains from his birth, crying, "Here, I carried it all the way for you." I decided to take a risk and spring one long poem on you. That phrase that strikes fear in the heart of everyone at a poetry reading, especially if you're me. Don't be too alarmed. This this poem is not that long. And it's in 12 parts. But the parts are short, and they are numbered, so you'll know. You'll have a measurement of the progress we're all making. We'll see if we can get through this thing together. It occurs to me that Paul Ann saw this poem early, not in that early writing group, but in a Portland writing group we were both involved with for a while, in the vicinity of 1990, 91, 92, like that. And she characterized it as a natural history of me and my awareness of death. The title is The Unseen. 1. Don't despair. My brethren, my sistren, don't despair. 1. Mustard crowds the barbed wire fence, the entire hillside thick with light and growing brighter as the pale sky goes dim. The single oak is hazed with April leaves. Across the valley, children call, quick strokes of sound. A wavering cloud of sparrows passes. A kestrel hovers on beating wings. Impossibly much, but I need more tonight than the bare glory of what's given. I need to rub this moment in mind for the shimmer of meaning I almost see. I need the boy who stood shivering once in a different field, hands clenched at his sides in the clammy dusk, as he silently burned into mind the whippoorwills, silhouettes of trees, the bright clear blue of the west. I'll remember, he whispered, even when I'm dead, I'll remember this. 2. It always came to emptiness, a dark wind, the light of cold stars passing through me. I breathed once. I walked in my body. Nothing, I don't know, I'd say when my mother asked what made me cry. And as the light went out, switch on, switch off, I knew that even the dream was wrong, that when I died there would be no stars, nothing in my mind, no me, and I would not return in all of time. Three. Birdsong woke me to the hunger. As pale light filled the window, I watched with one eye open, wondering what I wanted. Nothing in my parents' house or school or Sunday school, but something I had never tasted, something in the still trees, the songs of hidden birds calling in the cool morning as I still slept. It was nowhere in the world and everywhere, if I could just find words to name it. 4. I lay on the pavement trying to see. The snake raised his broken neck, swaying as if there was something he still needed. I was looking for the moment. His jaws stretched, and from deep in the darkness of his throat, a dry hiss forced its way. In a spasm, he subsided. It was the spirit leaving him, I told myself, pressing the skin of his small piled body. He twitched and lay still. I heard the spirit, I said out loud, and stood in the stillness of the summer afternoon. 5. I'd sit where the trunk divided and watch how the limbs divided again, how the branches branched and made themselves a confusion of a million twig ends touching air. And I wondered, if a bud on one twig end awakened by itself, if all it saw was twigs and buds and sky, could it ever know where it came from? How, before it opened as a leaf and fell, how could it think its way back through those chance divisions, through the entire blind branching history, that had brought it to its place in empty air. Part 6 of the Unseen. Kneeling by the animal tracks I didn't know, I felt hidden eyes upon me, close, and everything stood clearer, brighter then, each twig, each fallen leaf in the puddles from the morning's rain. As I hiked back through woods and fields where nothing moved but me, watched by something wild that stirred my groin and made me whip around to stare at only stones and honeysuckle, the hillside's green horizon, the shining of last light on boughs. Those things meant more than just themselves. They stood for everything I couldn't know, but was close around me as I walked home, hollow-bellied with happiness, beneath the darkening forest trees and the bright scattered tracks of all the stars. Seven. Wind on the waters, rippling there, rippling the reeds that gracefully give way and rest. Now down shore the rippling reeds, now here again, as the water quickens with sheens and glints. If it were given, I would come back. If it were given, I would roam here always, touching the face of what I loved. 8. Fired with sun, the red-tail drifts deep in the sky, circling higher and higher in that volume of light. I dream and drift along, drowsing below. I feel the streaming air, the land turning beneath me. To die might feel like this, my speck of self ascending so far into the light that it becomes the light at last. And now as I rise to go, I see near my imprint in the grass 2 yellow slugs, curled in semicircles, stroking each other with their snouts, stretching filaments of slime as they stroke. They raise their blind, faceless mouths. They stir themselves in the light of sun. Nine. This is the path where the panther waits, shadowing the things of day. His keen eyes glow, I call them stars. His breath stirs, I call it wind. His black coat quickens, and this is the place I always falter. This is the shadow of his unborn leap, where he waits to rend my hide of fear, where I might be born or disappear. Ten. Paralyzed, I see my heart gone still. My hands can't reach to squeeze it, pound it to life again. Arteries around it stiffen. I give up then. And from those roots and the cold stone they circumscribe, a great tree grows. I watch it rise, watch it swaying in the light of sky, and I feel my body stretch and tremble. (11) High to the north, a snow peak stands in the last deep light, the nameless one that sends this Blackwater stream swirling through the chill of dusk. Nothing in the stream's quick passing, nothing in the snow and silent trees, nothing in the mountain glowing with last sun, nothing here knows my presence, and nothing will be lesser when I've gone. It isn't much, this shivering warmth I cradle like a candle, worried how it flickers, how it burns low. I would let it burn. I would turn it loose to the beautiful indifference of this world, where the first stars are shining, the mountain stands in stillness, and the stream swirls past one small light in the darkening trees. And the final section of The Unseen. If the way is anywhere, it's here in the dodge and mingle of mustard flowers, flattening as the wind comes on. In the blue eucalyptus, swirling wild with a shimmer of water sound, and even in the stiff oak limbs that stir as if remembering just now what motion is. It doesn't seem so difficult, this fluid aimlessness, this ease with which things bend as they hold firm. What flows in trees and rippled silvery through the grass is loosening my fear-bound spirit that thinking tried and tried to free. If I can learn this limbering, if I can dance this earthly dance like all things touched by wind, when the hour comes, I might be ready to swirl loose from all I know. All right, let's lighten the tone a little. Kind of makes you want to, stuff like that kind of makes you want to stand up and pray, you know. Can't have too much of it. Let's see, where do I want to go from here? I was, when I first seriously tried to sit down and write poems, though my first aim was to be a fiction writer, more on that later. Didn't work out at the time. I was living at that time on a ranch east of Klamath Falls, near Bonanza, between Bonanza and Bly, if you know that country at all. I was writing what I hoped were poems, and I was. But yeah. and you never lose that doubt, and maybe that's a good thing. You know? I don't know. I took a bold notion. I had discovered the work of Wendell Berry, and I took a notion to write him a letter. I don't know how. I must have sent it through a publisher. I certainly did not know him at the time. Two things about his response astonished me. First, there was a response. In this case, handwritten in pen on yellow legal paper. Second thing that astonished me was not the great praise he heaped on my poems, because he didn't do that. Yet he criticized them in a way that made me feel like I was doing something authentic. He criticized the poems as too diffuse and prosaic. And then, this was actually the second astonishing thing, he said that he found some of his own work deserved the same criticism. I thought, I could be a writer. I could be a poet. And what a generous act. It wasn't a long letter. It was certainly not a letter he had to answer. So Wendell Berry became a mentor before I even ever met him. And after I did, in those days in the 1980s at Stanford, when Marilyn and I lived down there, roughly from 82 to 88, I met him when he came to give a reading. And since then, we've been lucky enough to become friends of the Berrys. We have visited them several times at Lade's Landing Farm in Kentucky, and we've hosted them here in Oregon. So this short poem came from a dream, and I wrote it before having settled down and living 18 years now in the same place. Before that, my life, like many of us in youth, was one of constant motion. it's not where it ought to be, but I'm going to find it. I know it's in this book because I put it there. Yeah. Oh, yeah, it was there. First things first. Dreaming, when I asked Wendell Berry for seeds, his hands turned the pages of a bulky, loose book, bulging with woven and wax paper pouches, specks, fat kernels, wings and barbs, corn and rice grass tucked under straps, tufts of wheat and long-eared oats on the pages his hands keep turning. "What kind did you want?" he says. I forgot as the pages went by. "Where do you live?" he's asking now. And I know, of course, or thought I did. "Well, take what you want," he says with a grin. "But don't you think you'll need a place to plant 'em?" Here's another poem from a dream. This one is actually one of the newer poems. It's the first poem in the section of newer or new-ish poems. I've been working on some of them for many years, but they haven't appeared in a collection before. This is titled Working Draft. And when I say a poem comes from a dream, I don't mean that the poem is a direct record of the dream. I mean that it leaves me with certain images, maybe some snatches of narrative, and emotional coloration, and those materials I, over time, work into a poem. The dream doesn't just say, "Here's a poem," you know. Nothing's ever said that to me. Dreaming, waking. Working draft. Still half in my dream, I see the memoir I'm writing, the familiar manuscript pages, and a sure and stately voice is speaking the prose just as it should be spoken, as I never can. But the words themselves elude me now that I listen. The voice is a river of syllables, not quite said, and the type, though it is my font, won't focus either, nor the penned-in edits, as if I were trying to read underwater. This isn't my memoir. It's a text I've forgotten, my best book maybe, already in draft. And now as it's time to leave, I'm frantic to have it, but the pages hover just out of reach as I rise away, the sure voice fading, and now as my eyes are about to open, I see. I didn't make this manuscript. This manuscript is making me, the life inside my life, composing, revising, imagining on, down in the depths whose lit surface I just now break. Whoa, are you kidding me? All right, I'll speed it up a bit. I'll read maybe three more of the newer poems, give you a sense of them. There are kind of a disparate lot, but this poem is called Spring Burning. One April morning in the rain, I pile green boughs from the big Douglas fir, whose limbs had sagged on the barn. I splash gas, toss a match, and whoop, out of nowhere, an orange explosion subsiding to a hesitant burn, flames stirring like sleepy children, still thralled by the other world. Then a quickening hiss and crackle of sap-gorged wood, and the flames remember their yellow hunger, climbing the heaped greens with a rising roar. I heave more branches, my hat lowered to the sheer smack of heat that instantly sizzles the needle sprays black, singes my mustache, frizzes the hairs on the backs of my hands, and I wonder, as I feed it, big sections of limb, how we ever got it locked in the tips of matches, or in motors idling at our feet, how we trained it to simmer saucepans or stand docile on candle wicks, a flutter as one of us walks by, the one slight sign that once the world was its seething cauldron, and is that yet within. Live, I say, tossing junkwood now, rotted shingles and posts, a wobbly sawhorse. Live now and not this summer. But it isn't for prudence or precaution that I feed and feed that unbearable aura. It's for the flames that exult around each gift, transforming hard heft in their red, livid heart to the nothing it was and is. Ashes drift down with the sprinkling rain. With no more to offer, I stand aside, gazing like a kid at the great burning tent I will someday enter. It gathers itself from the dull clay ground. It writhes and yearns. It points to the far, invisible stars it has not forgotten. You're a great audience. Those sounds of appreciation are so much better than applauding. It's much better. You can save that for the end if you're moved. Here's a poem I wrote to myself, to my younger self. Actually, the Reed College lets me claim it as an alma mater. That's kind of nice, and I like to claim it. And I think I've given them some reason so far to claim me. So for a reunion sort of program a few years ago, they asked, Reed Magazine asked to write, me and several others, to write what you would say to the Reed student you were all those years ago. So the title is, To a Reed College Sophomore Soon to Drop Out. Fall 1967. Well, it's clear you're not the talking kind, but I can see you at least. You're cadging steak night scraps in commons, learning to climb on gorge basalt, writing a paper for Hume 110 all night in Eliot Hall, and grilling burgers in the coffee shop amid laughter not yours. Why do you cling so hard to loneliness? Why fear what you most want? To open up. Trust more. That's mainly what I've got to say. But you're not answering, so I'll go on. Be more skeptical of drugs, more respectful of the classes and professors you consider irrelevant to your life. You don't have a life, remember? You drift the campus, drizzling fall, flowering spring, hoping life will track you down and jump you in a flash of knowing. You yearn for enlightenment. I've got good news for you on that, but first, the bad. You'll never find it. Not in acid, your desultory zen, or anything else. Not in your first 60 years, anyway. I write, you see, and if I were enlightened, surely I'd be selling a lot more books. Yes, I'm a writer, as you hope to be, though you hope with scant belief. I have a home, too, a wife, stepsons, grandkids even. I've got a life, and I'd like to know, of course, how you would rate it. But you're stone quiet, you deaf-mute boy, and just as well, the man you have become might disappoint you. I prefer martinis to pot or mescaline. I buy from businesses you would despise. The U.S. is waging needless war again. I hate it, but I don't resist. I don't give rides to hitchhikers. I own things and tread in rutted habits you would scorn, you with your pure, prideful intolerance. I'm compromised. But look, you should be pleased that I'm still here. and that I've learned in our 45 years apart. The good news about enlightenment: you don't need it. Follow the truest hungers of your spirit, and the common light of day will do you fine. One thing will lead to another, and through the good and painful years, you'll realize that life is not still hazily ahead or off in a distant land, but here, now, you. You'll do not as well as your best hopes, but far better than your worst fears. And this you will call happiness. Trust me on it. All right. Maybe the next one's a good one to close on. Whoa. I'm telling you. How many here, like me, are not natives of the state of Oregon? Yeah, it's about the usual majority. I am far from a native of Oregon, but you know what? I love this state. I love this region. I keep my patriotism pretty close to home. And the state of Oregon is the place that kept drawing me back, the place I always wanted to come back to. So I'm envious of you who are Oregon natives. I wish I were an Oregon native, but I'm not. So I wrote this poem, which I hope will have a little fun both with natives and non-natives alike. If, like me, you are not an Oregon native but wish you were. 1. There's only about 7 parts. 1. Roll your eyes, laugh loud, derisively, throw a punch even when someone calls it Oregon. 2. Call a downpour a little rain. Call rain mist. Call mist sunlight. Call sunlight too damn much like California for me. 3. Study journals of the Oregon Trail. Buy an antique pen, some ink, and a sheaf of hemp paper. Write a journal of the Oregon Trail, rich with misery and fortitude, by your great-grandfather. Bind the journal in rawhide, spill coffee and stew on the pages, age it for years half buried in the high desert, discover it in your attic, and call the local news. 4. In September, make sure you say Filbert. Even though it rhymes with Dilbert, and your inner voice keeps screaming, hazelnut. 5. In the country, resist the urge to hug trees. In the woods with others, nod your head and say, nice timber there. Buy a chainsaw, keep it sharp, and know how to use it. It's a flat dead giveaway to drop a tree on yourself. 6. If you're serious about this, have a child in Oregon and name it after you. Send the kid to live with grandparents in Maine, or even better, with a nice Siberian family, and steal the kid's identity. Ask the kid how to do this on the family computer before shipping him or her away. In the final section of this poem, with my thanks for your turning out and your attention, thanks again to all involved in making this series work, for paying poetry itself the honor of the institution that you have created and are creating here. There's time if you want for if you're moved for questions and answers for a little while afterward, but you don't have to. 7, if nothing else works, try this. Die in the rain and dissolve in a puddle. Get reborn as a slug and work your way toward the human again. Haunt each body you inhabit with one indelible thought. I don't know why, but I must return to the puddle to die. Be patient. When finally you are born as a human being, pray that the first mouth to kiss you will be berry-stained and fragrant with salmon. And if the first words to form in your mouth are, "No sales tax, damn it," you are born again. This time in the best of states. Thank you. Anyone with a question or comment or weather report?
You talked about Wendell Berry. What writers would you say influenced your work?
You know, I think this is not altogether to evade your question, but I think every writer you've read influences your work because it all becomes part of the compost of your reading. True enough, you know, and then you never know what likenesses, what comes up from that compost. You know, they might show a little bit of this. I mean, I hear Bill Stafford in some of my poems. I hear Wendell in some of my poems. I hear Denise Levertov, another teacher of mine. I hear dangerous to cite a living poet, but Mary Oliver. I hate these lists because you leave people out, but Gary Snyder, but I spend a lot of time in the past too. My two favorite American poets are Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. And I love many poets in the Western tradition, the George Herberts and the John Donnes, and the William Shakespeares. So a lot of, that's in terms of poetry, a whole lot. Yeah. Well, thanks again. Oh, yes, ma'am.
What is your writing practice like? Every day, or how do you think?
Yes, irregular. I do write at home. My stepson helped me partition off a room in the two-car garage that we don't use. So I do have a place to go. It's not separate from the house, but you go through two doors to get to it, so it's kind of separate.
That's good.
Yeah. So if things are, if there's something going on, I mean, if I'm working on a book or I just yesterday got a poem to move, I mean, I'll tend to look at it during daylight hours, but I'm also doing other things. I'm doing domestic economy. I'm distracted by the usual things we distract ourselves with. And I learned long ago that they say there are larks and owls. I'm an owl. Many days I just feel like I'm only becoming fully awake by twilight or dusk. So swing shift is pretty much prime time for me. And around the horn at midnight into a graveyard shift sometimes. And I try to keep it somewhat in hand, this tendency to go to bed late and get up late. And when I have honest work, which is rarely, like teaching, I obviously adjust my schedule. I like the night. I like the solitude. I like looking through my reflection in that window into the great mystery beyond it. And I scribble words on paper, not on the computer at first. I start with longhand, but then once something shows signs of life, I'll get it on the computer pretty quick. Very supple editing instrument. Man,
Yes, this on the broadside, you
Nope.
didn't mention this.
I was supposed to read it. Let me read it.
But I was curious as to the background.
Yeah. This is a short one. The poem that these people have been good enough to make a broadside of, titled Ourselves, it comes from that same ranch in Langell Valley between Bonanza and Bly that most of my early poems came from. There was no particular context. Ourselves. When the throaty calls of sandhill cranes echo across the valley, when the rimrock flares incandescent red, and the junipers are flames of green on the short grass hills, in that moment of last clear light, when the world seems ready to speak its name, meet me in the field alongside the pond, without careers for once, without things to do, without dreams or anger or the rattle of fears. We'll ask how it can be that we walk this ground and know that we walk, alive in a world that didn't have to be beautiful, alive in a world that doesn't have to be. With no answers, just ourselves and silence, we'll listen for the song that waits to be learned, the song that moves through the passing light. I will say that it came from the 1980s, and when I was very concerned about the nuclear arms race and Armageddon in that form. Surely that played into it. Yeah. Yes.
I had a question I was curious about, because I know you were down at Stanford doing a Stegner Fellowship. And what's your relationship in this country? You know, so many writers teach, and they're part of the academy.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's some hazard in that. And certainly Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, that was not their course.
It's such a contemporary phenomenon. Creative writers being teachers of creative writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people aren't aware of that. You know, William Shakespeare didn't have an MFA program. I've approached that like you. I've been wary of it. I have actually many friends, and many of them managed to be full-time professors and writers. I was afraid that wouldn't work for me. I actually like teaching, but I found I do better in limited doses. And I think I'm a better teacher that way than I would be if it were a continuous deal. So I've applied and held several writer-in-residence jobs at different colleges and universities, for a quarter or a semester or 2.5 years, one place back east. So little hunks of teaching to make some cash and to revive myself. I like being around young people. There's something, there's a real tonic. It's not just for the money. But I've been skeptical of holding a full-time tenured job in a college and university. And I have to credit my wife, who believes in my work and was willing to work herself for many years to be the principal breadwinner in our family. She's right over there, redhead. All right. Well, thank you very much. If you care to buy a book, I'll be ready to sign one for you. So thanks again.
Let's give John a